Is Gatsby a dystopia?
I absolutely think that this can be read, and probably should be read, as a deeply existentially worrying text about the nature of ambition, about the relationship between ambitious individuals, and about the nature of what counts as success.
It's a UConn podcast. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And Jeff, we're here today to discuss Gatsby at 100.
Yes.
100 years ago, almost to the day The Great Gatsby was released. That makes the novel even older than you.
Slightly.
Yep. And so we're going to talk about what The Great Gatsby says and what it means, and maybe how those meanings have changed.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you want to start this? Do you want to talk about maybe the ways we've encountered this novel in the past?
Yeah, you like to sometimes call this a temperature check or an initial temperature check.
Oh, okay. Yes, a temperature check.
How we came to the text, what our history with the text is, and kind of a quick preview maybe of our senses of the text.
Okay.
Sure. So unlike, I think, a great many contemporary Americans, I did not encounter The Great Gatsby until I was in my early 20s.
It wasn't assigned to you in high school? I thought this was universal for Americans.
Well, this is one of the stories of the text, is that it is almost universal, but for whatever reason, I never encountered it. And I did encounter a few of Fitzgerald's short stories in my high school literature class, American literature class, but not The Great Gatsby itself. So I came to this text a little bit later, I think, than most people do. And I do think that that is important in ways maybe we'll talk about a bit later. And then it's a text that I have sort of returned to again and again over the course of my adulthood, which, as you say, is slightly less than the age of the text itself. I should also say that I encountered the novel first. Only after I had already engaged the novel did I come across first the Robert Redford movie from the 1970s, and then, of course, much later, the more recent Baz Luhrmann movie with DiCaprio starring as Gatsby. So that's kind of where I came to it from. And I should also say that I read The Great Gatsby in the same summer that I read Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. And at the time, I think I was more impressed as a 21-year-old with The Sun Also Rises. That didn't last long, though, I will say. I think that of the two texts, it's kind of a blowout. Gatsby is considerably better, considerably richer, and more evocative, and has a much longer and more meaningful life, and is far more rewarding for repeat visits than is The Sun Also Rises.
Eat that, Ernest.
Yeah.
You, Hemingway.
Well, I mean, that guy deserves a little bit more heat, I think, than he gets. He was somebody who was very happy to tell others how he felt about them, so it's fine for us to have the same reaction.
Hot takes on Gatsby's birthday.
On Gatsby's birthday. Well, here I am fighting for Fitzgerald,
Exactly.
who neither knows nor cares.
No. But if he did, he would be touched.
He would be. So as we'll talk about, I really think of this book, and you alluded to it in the intro, as one of the great American novels. And it's hard for me because of that. I agree with that. And I also read this novel as so deeply entrenched in place that it's hard for me to imagine it outside of its context of American mythology, which is, I think, one of the reasons I'm so curious and excited about doing this pod, because you, of course, did not encounter, well, you did encounter this text, I guess, in the United States, but you encountered it as a Brit.
Yeah, I'm a new American. So I read this. Now, was I an American? No, I've read this twice in my life. Once in like the past week, because I knew we were going to talk about it. Yeah. And then once, I think like 10 years ago, when I was living in the US and had been for sort of 15 years, but was not yet a quote unquote proper American.
You were not yet a citizen.
I was not yet a citizen, so I still carried the terrible burden of the British bondage upon my person. And so when I first read Gatsby, and I obviously read it because it's the great American novel, and but I read it for pleasure. I read it outside of that high school context. It was never assigned to me. Where you were all, or most Americans were reading Gatsby, I had Shakespeare foisted upon me.
Right.
And of course I had the reaction to Shakespeare that I think a lot of Americans tell me they have to Gatsby, which is something is assigned to you as homework and it instantly becomes homework. Yeah. It just can't be art or literature or, so I read it just straight up, oh, I should read this. It's important work. And I remember liking it, you know, and you know, but not thinking that deeply about it. And the one thing I remembered from my first reading was actually a misremembrance, which was I had this strong sense that what had happened in the novel at its kind of climactic point was that reckless Gatsby had been driving his sports car and he'd mowed down Daisy Buchanan in the middle of the road, which of course is not at all what happens. It's kind of, you know, it's a sort of hallucination of something that sort of happens that we'll get into. So that's what I remembered. Reading it again for the second time, knowing that we were going to talk about it in the pod, I definitely got a lot more out of it because I was looking for the types of things we talk about on the pod, which are kind of the mythologies of the American dream, the kind of symbolism, the degree to which the story's operating on an allegorical level. And then I was really interested in doing the research for the pod in understanding how intentional a work this was for Fitzgerald, that he was sort of annoyed by his reputation. I think he had a reputation as a literary star, but he believed that he wasn't yet regarded as a great artist, and he said, "I'm gonna take forever on Gatsby," which is a short book. I mean, it proves that kind of dictum. If I'd had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter, right? So it's a short book that Fitzgerald made deliberately short and used and was treated words as very expensive, right? Was very deliberative in the language that he used, precisely because he was saying, "I want this to be my kind of artistic contribution." Or my masterwork.
Yeah.
And I definitely got that sense. You know, there are obviously hugely famous passages that even if you don't know they're hugely famous, you kind of mark up in your book. You're like, "Oh,
they're notable."
Yeah, that kind of seems to be saying something pretty profound. So that's what I got out of it this time.
Yeah, and I think that's a keen insight about Fitzgerald's intentions with this text. That I think it was part of his annoyance with his popular reputation was that I think he was seen as insubstantial. And as somebody who had a great flair and a great talent technically for writing, but whose words didn't carry much substance. And I mean, this was certainly Hemingway himself had quite a lot to do with this reputation, which was almost certainly born out of jealousy on Hemingway's part. But what this means is that Gatsby was intentionally seen by Fitzgerald as the place where he could try to elevate himself into a kind of a rarefied air as an American literary figure. And to create something as the introduction to the new 100-year version that we looked at for this time around argues is to create something that's sort of beyond oneself, right? A work of creative intention that aspires beyond what you take to be your limits. And this, of course, is Jay Gatsby's theme, or his ambition to move beyond what is taken to be his limits. But it's also, there's a way in which there's an analog there to Fitzgerald's creative process. He clearly sees this as what he hopes to be his masterwork, the thing that is better than anything he's ever done before, something that is better than what he probably imagined he was capable of. And, there's a sense in which I think it's an astonishing success. I think he absolutely accomplishes that. But it also, I think it's probably one of the things that becomes a problem for Fitzgerald over the rest of his life, his creative life. What do you do after you have accomplished what is more than you thought you could ever do?
Well, but it's worse than that, though, because he may have held that view of the text, but the text was not received that way.
Correct.
Right? It was reviewed in you can find reviews that are rapturous, that look good, in retrospect, but the median review was, this is what sort of a flashy but insubstantial work,
hyper local.
Yeah,
right. This is just about rich people in New York, and who cares?
Well, and isn't that because Fitzgerald had an earlier popular hit? Two early popular hits, and so it was seen as, this is the kind of book Fitzgerald writes, and it's kind of parties and flappers and jazz age and all the rest of it, which are misapprehensions that bleed over into the reading of the new text.
Right. And so the book was widely anticipated because of Fitzgerald's already high literary star, but it was, as you say, critically, it was not received particularly well. And so popularly, at a time in American literature in which, critical appraisal really did tend to forerun popular appeal. It didn't sell very well. And it's a book that sort of disappeared into the ether. In that way, The Great Gatsby is reminiscent of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which was essentially greeted the same way, right? What would eventually come to be seen as Melville's clear masterwork. And with Gatsby, I think arguably one of the 2 or 3 most important American novels. It was at the time a broad critical and commercial failure and disappointment. And it was only later in life, or posthumously in Melville's case, as in Fitzgerald's case, that the book came to the popular and the critical renown that it should have had all along.
And this really ate Fitzgerald up. I mean, he was desperately disappointed, and he kept thinking he had terrible trouble titling the book. And The Great Gatsby was a title he was really, really unsure of. He wanted it to be called, is it Trimalchio in West Egg?
Right.
Which no one would have known what that meant. You know, and it wouldn't have been a better title necessarily, but he didn't think The Great Gatsby was a very good title. And he would keep badgering his editor to, you know, both before the book's published, like, I'm not sure about the title, and then afterwards he kept saying things like, could we re-release it in a different edition? Would it then find an audience? And you know, and you can tell the angst in this correspondence he has with his editor, that I've written this great thing and why will no one appreciate that it's great? And of course the great tragedy is he dies thinking it's been a total failure.
Yes.
And damn it, he was right.
Yeah, and he was at the time, he was absolutely right, but he was also right in seeing it as a total failure, and in likely dividing his career into a before and after Gatsby, because what comes afterwards is not anywhere of the caliber. Right? He's really struggled with the follow-up Tender is the Night, which has moments, but it's long and it's so autobiographical that it's hard to. It's autobiographical in a way that feels slavishly devoted to a resuscitation of his own personal grievances. Gatsby is perhaps autobiographical in the way it feels inspiring, right? Or taking bits and pieces of personal experience and crafting it into a larger narrative. That's not how Tender is the Night reads. And then it was even more downhill for him creatively after Tender is the Night. The Last Tycoon, which was published in fragments posthumously, has a couple of decent ideas, but it's not successful. And, you know, he was sort of infamously unsuccessful in Hollywood as a scriptwriter. Which he had tried to do to make money, and he died early at age 44. He had lived the life of an addict. He was a kind of a brutal alcoholic for almost the entirety of his adult life, and you know, he died of a heart attack at age 44, and so he would have died, I suspect, having felt like he had lived an ultimately disappointing and failed creative life.
Yeah, and what happens, as I understand it, and you can tell me if this is kind of a mythology, an old wives' tale, as we say in Britain. But what happened, as I understand it, to resuscitate The Great Gatsby, is that during the Second World War, American troops are sent abroad, and they don't have anything to read. This is before smartphones. I mean, of course, now they'd all be on TikTok or whatever. But you know, and the notion is, let's print them up some armed services editions of great books.
Particularly ones that have fallen out of copyright.
Yeah. Oh, I say yes. Of course, that would be one of the motivations. And so there are these stories, and they would be quite small, so they could fit in the pockets of the uniforms. And there are these stories of people landing on D-Day beaches, and they're on the boats waiting to go across. They're reading, but it's so funny because, like, and Great Gatsby is one of these books, which then puts it in the hands of, you know, hundreds of thousands of Americans who read it, and it gains a popular appeal, which leads to a critical reappraisal. And many of these soldiers would, you know, take advantage of the GI Bill. Some of them went on to be teachers, and they would then teach the book, and it becomes this kind of staple of the American educational system. There's some critical ferment and American culture. So there were 2 books that I read about that were given this treatment. The Great Gatsby, which I think maybe contrary to its reputation among contemporary American teenagers, I think is actually pretty engaging and somewhat propulsive. I mean, it has a reputation as a novel in which not much happens. I'm not convinced that that's the case. A fair amount happens in 200 pages.
Yeah.
The other book that I read this was done to was the one you just mentioned, Moby Dick.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being an American soldier on D-Day and you're like, I don't know, like, I'm sorry to be macabre here, but like, what are my chances of surviving this? They're not 100%.
Yeah.
You know, and where am I in Moby Dick? I wonder what happens. Oh, I'm at the bit where he does the 200 pages on the whaling industry. You know, it's gonna be the last thing that I read on the on the landing craft.
Well, that is one big difference between Moby Dick and Great Gatsby is they both have propulsive openings. The first several chapters of Moby Dick are highly engaging. They're in some ways they're high comedy, but you know I don't know what the analog would have been if Fitzgerald had done 200 pages on the stock market.
Yeah,
maybe. You know, in the middle of the Great Gatsby, that's sort of the analog for
Nick's internship in behind the scenes.
Yes.
In detail.
But the history that you relayed just now in shorthand about the way that the text becomes has its renaissance, its popular and cultural renaissance, is a really fascinating story. It converges a whole bunch of different sort of trend lines in American history, 20th century American history. And it's a story, if viewers and listeners are really interested in, that's relayed very well in the literary critic Maureen Corrigan's book that's called And So We Read On.
Yes.
So she really kind of fleshes out the history of it there. But it's a fascinating story.
And so we pod on.
So we pod on.
Host against the algorithm.
And on our pod.
And on our pod, we have
the way we try to fool the algorithm is the three-part method.
Yes, we have a three-part method by which we address texts of all kinds. I mean, we're doing a book again, which is sort of remarkable for as a second book we've ever addressed, and it's The Great Gatsby. A three-part methodology by which we address texts. The first part is the level that we call surface, on the surface, in which we sort of address kind of what the text says, what the plot is, what it is we think the author is sort of explicitly putting on the page or on the screen or in the music or whatever the text is. The second part, sorry, go ahead.
Even before we move on to the second part, ordinarily we tend to dispose of the first surface level of analysis relatively quickly. This, I think, is going to be an exception because we rarely run across, it seems to me, popular culture texts that are as deeply and intricately layered as The Great Gatsby is.
Okay.
So I think there's going to be some bleeding of the first and second levels in ways that we don't usually, they kind of cross-pollination that we don't usually.
Yeah. So in Jeff's show notes that he put together, the show notes this time, you know, usually, as you say, the first level show notes are like just a couple of points, and this one goes on about 3 pages. Crikey, Jeff, we have 2 others to get to, and those 2 are the second one is mythologies, in which we talk about the meaning structures that are necessary in order to understand the text. You had assigned to me the homework of what's he called, Bewley? Is that Maurice Bewley?
Marius Bewley.
Marius Bewley, who is a mid-century literary critic. Yeah. Anyway, he talks a lot about Gatsby as a mythical figure. Yes. That might be something we touch on. I know you've got another few points in here. Mm-hmm. And then the final level of analysis that we engage is critique.
Yes. And the third level, I should just say before we get to the third level, the first and second level, I think there's going to be a lot of crossover here because we rarely encounter it. Ordinarily, when we talk about second level, we are focused less on the intentions of the author and more on the experience that the audience will have, the kinds of, as you say, the meaning structures, the cultural themes that an audience would bring with it to the act of engaging with the text. But in The Great Gatsby, a lot of what's happening, it seems to me, intentionally in the text is a self-conscious playing with broad cultural themes and mythologies. So, I think we'll kind of seamlessly move between those first 2 levels of analysis in a lot of ways.
And in a sense, I don't quite know how to elaborate at this point, but we're often bringing meaning structures to interpret texts.
Yes.
But in this one, the text itself is almost remaking or creating a specific version and a specific critique of the largest American myth, right? Which is the American dream. And that's what the text is famous for. And so it's not, you can't really bring the American dream to analyze Gatsby. It's almost Gatsby is crystallizing a particular version and a particular explosion of the
which bleeds us into the third level of our third level analysis as well, which we refer to as critique. And we usually do a couple of different things here. So we will spend time frequently talking about the ways in which learned audiences or learned critics in particular have received the text. We've already sort of alluded to some of that. We're going to get a lot more of that in the other two levels of analysis. And then sometimes we will also use this level of analysis as a way of thinking through how the text might offer a particular vision of community life, how it might, sometimes it points to a better life. Sometimes it points to sort of, a worse or lesser set of outcomes. And as you say, all of that is kind of already embedded in the text in a way that is, I think, unusual for a lot of the products that we have looked at so far.
Is Gatsby a dystopia?
Potentially.
Yeah.
I think there's a way in which we'll talk about this, but I absolutely think that this can be read and probably should be read as a deeply existentially worrying text about the nature of ambition, about the relationship between ambitious individuals, and about the nature of what counts as success, right? And how to live a mature life that revolves around conventional ideals of success.
Okay. All right. So I think we should just very quickly take a break, and then we'll be right back with our first level of analysis on the surface.
Okay.
And we are back with our centennial, that's the word, isn't it? Our centennial discussion of The Great Gatsby. We are going to talk now about the surface features of the text, what it is that Fitzgerald put in the text. And I think you wanted to start, Jeff, with a very brief recap of the plot.
Yeah, we'll do a quick plot summary. Yeah. Most of our audience, I think, is going to be familiar with the broad outlines here. So this is a story that takes place in early 1920s, 1922, New York City, and mostly Long Island. And it is the story of a kind of mysterious but very rich and seemingly powerful figure named J. Gatsby, who seems to have come onto the New York/Long Island scene very recently. Not much is known about his past. The only thing that's really known about him is that he's fabulously wealthy. He seems to be very important. He seems to have a lot of connections kind of throughout the New York City landscape. And
connections, I think you mean.
Yes. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And he throws amazing social events, incredible parties, most weekends during the summer. And the first character that we come across, though, is not Jay Gatsby. It actually takes several chapters before we are introduced to the figure of Jay Gatsby. First person we run across is a young, well, not so young, about 30? A 29 or 30-year-old named Nick Carraway, who is our narrator, our kind of erstwhile conscious. In many ways, I think we're supposed to envision the action through Nick Carraway's experience. Nick Carraway is from Chicago. He did his studies at Yale in New Haven. He is from a prosperous family, a prosperous Midwest family, but not an old money family of the sort that he has familial relations with and who he will encounter very soon. He heads off to New York City. He's staked by his father, financially staked by his father, to enter into what was then still the pretty new world of modern finance. He's going to study bonds. He's going to be a player on the stock market. So Wall Street, New York City, Manhattan is the absolute obvious place for him to arrive. But he doesn't live in the city. He lives on one of the islands in Long Island, which Fitzgerald fictionalizes as West Egg. And West Egg is, I suppose, opposed to East Egg, which is its neighboring island. East Egg is truly an enclave of the rich and powerful. It's the enclave of old money. On West Egg, you've got a much newer population, one that is sort of increasingly flushed with what we might call new money, that is made in the growing financial markets. Sometimes this is money that is entertainment-based money. So this is early 1920s, late teens, early 1920s. This is the birth of American modern popular culture. This is when movies, for example, and Hollywood is becoming a kind of center of storytelling. But there's still a great deal of that takes place in New York City as the cultural hub. So we've got this story of old money and new money. Nick is from a prosperous family, and he's been staked for the summer work by his father, but he is not old money. And so the place he's going to go to try to find to live is this, is going to be the West Egg, and he ends up renting a kind of a 2 or 3 room shack that is located literally right next to Jay Gatsby's unbelievable mansion. And so the story begins.
Yeah. So I suppose that this could have been a different novel if Nick had just called the police and made a noise complaint.
Yes. He does not. He's fine with all the noise, and he will eventually be a part of all the noise.
I would have made the noise complaint.
Yes.
The Great Dyson would have been a very different novel.
Honestly, I probably would have too. But this is not a quiet space.
Right. And so what's happening is Gatsby's putting on these parties to which he invites Nick Carraway, and Nick discovers he's one of the only people who's ever invited.
Yes.
People instead just arrive.
They just show up because these parties have become renowned as the place to be. Right?
Yeah.
And so, it's one of these things, somebody and he doesn't turn anybody away. Gatsby doesn't turn anybody away. And the reason, of course, he doesn't turn anybody away, we eventually find out, is the same reason why he has specifically invited Nick Carraway. That's because these parties are intended to draw the attention of one Daisy Buchanan. Daisy Buchanan lives in East Egg, literally across Long Island Sound, almost directly across Long Island Sound from the Gatsby mansion. She is married to a guy called Tom Buchanan. They are old money, both of them. Daisy Fay originally is from Louisville, Kentucky, as a part of an old money family. Tom Buchanan is a part of an old money family. This is generational wealth that we're talking about, which is what makes it money that's old. And we come to learn eventually that Jay Gatsby has had a fling, a romance in a previous life, 5 years earlier, with Daisy Fay. And that over the course of 5 years, in particular, as Gatsby is enlisted into the American Army and is sent over to fight in World War I, the romance is broken between the two. And in the intervening years, Daisy has gotten married to Tom Buchanan. She has had a child, a daughter. And during this time, Jay Gatsby has been longing for Daisy and has been trying to remake himself, self-consciously remake himself and enrich himself to become the kind of rich and powerful and wealthy scion that he believes is necessary to woo back Daisy Buchanan. So this is, in the first place, a story about reinvention, a story about American mobility, the possibilities of American social and economic mobility. And Gatsby has dedicated his life and all of his efforts to turning himself into a worthy beau for Daisy.
Okay, and he does eventually kind of manipulate things so that he's able to...
Yeah. And we should also, of course, note that the way that Nick Carraway figures into this is that Daisy is Nick's cousin.
Right.
And so they already have a connection, right? And so the first substantive scene of the novel is one in which Nick is invited over to the Buchanan mansion for dinner. And so there's this set of interactions between Nick and the Buchanans. He already knows, Nick does, Tom Buchanan from their time at Yale, in which they both overlapped as undergraduates.
Yeah. And so Nick is supposed to be the conduit to get Gatsby to re-meet
Daisy.
And that's accomplished.
It's accomplished, but not in the way that Gatsby initially hopes, right? His goal for throwing these huge parties that become the to-do social events for all of Long Island is that he's hoping eventually that Daisy's going to wander on over, but of course she never does. And that should have been his first clue, that this is all ill-fated. Daisy Buchanan is old money. She is not someone who is going to wander over into a social event that appears to be one from the outside, and she will decide from the inside as well, is gauche and is gaudy and is full of this kind of pretension towards class and the sorts of easy dignity that old money is used to. She's not going to go to this kind of an event. And so it's at this point, after sort of eventually realizing that this is not what's going to happen, and then somehow becoming aware, Gatsby has somehow become aware of the familial connection between Nick and Daisy. It's at that point that Gatsby seeks to strike up this, it's not really a friendship, but this relationship with Nick, and ask him to be the conduit, as you say, to getting Daisy back into Gatsby's life.
Right, and they do eventually meet up. Gatsby, who's to this point been this unflappable sort of individual, kind of loses his cool around Daisy. Something more of his kind of pre-Gatsby and more. His real name is James Gatz.
Yes,
something more of the Gatz.
Yes,
starts coming out,
and it's also worth understanding that Daisy has no idea that Jay Gatsby is just across the sound.
Right.
And she has sort of moved on with her life.
Yeah.
And so it's quite the shock and the surprise, we're led to believe, for her to encounter Jay Gatsby over at this encounter that he has set up through Nick.
Yeah, and then eventually there's I'm just trying to move towards the end of the plot summary. There's a confrontation.
Yep.
Where Gatsby and Tom are essentially arguing over who. I mean, maybe there's some gender politics to this. Who owns Daisy's affections?
Well, I mean, before that, right? We should note that at least for several weeks, Jay Gatsby's attempts to woo back Daisy seem to be successful, right? They engage again in a summer affair, and it reaches the point where Jay Gatsby at least believes that it's time to try to, create the final break of Daisy from Tom, to have her get a divorce and come and marry Jay Gatsby. As you say, this leads to the final confrontation between Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, and through a series of misadventures, misrecognitions, we get the act of homicide, for which Jay Gatsby himself gets incorrectly but willingly blamed.
Yeah. So what happens is there's a big argument between Gatsby and Buchanan. And then Daisy and I don't know. I always get this wrong. Daisy is driving a car from East Egg back to West Egg,
from New York City, from Manhattan, back to Long Island,
and they go through the Valley of driving Gatsby's car. They go through the Valley of Ashes, which is this sort of working class area that. Well, it's where Tom himself is keeping a mistress.
It's working class, but it's also the ashes are. It's literally an ash heap. It's a dump. What we would call these days a garbage dump.
Right.
That is on the outskirts of Manhattan, and that sits at these sort of intersectional places between Manhattan and Long Island.
Yeah, and Tom Buchanan's mistress sees the car, thinks that Tom is in it or driving it.
Because she had seen, earlier in the day, Tom driving Gatsby's car on the way from Long Island into Manhattan.
Right, so as you say, there's all these misrecognitions.
Misrecognitions.
Kind of runs out into the world. Daisy mows her down.
Yes.
She dies, and then Myrtle's husband... assumes or is led to believe.
He's actively told by Tom Buchanan
that hey, Gatsby just killed
who's been responsible for this.
Killed your wife.
Yes.
And what's he called? George
Wilson.
George Wilson marches over to Gatsby's mansion, kind of confronts him, shoots Gatsby, and then shoots himself. Yes. So it's like a murder-suicide.
Yes.
And then that's kind of the end of the action of the novel. And Gatsby is unsuccessful in prizing. Gatsby takes the blame for Daisy's act.
Yes.
And so is a martyr in that sense, and has also proven sort of unsuccessful in breaking the bond between Daisy and Tom Buchanan.
Exactly. Daisy's mowing down, her homicide of Myrtle, occurs after she has effectively rejected Gatsby in favor of staying with
and then
Tom.
Daisy and Tom kind of
they plot
together,
essentially to pin the homicide on Jay Gatsby, and then they immediately disappear.
Yeah, with this sort of wake of destruction in the background. Okay, so that's the sort of plot. What else do we want to say about the surface?
So let's talk about the setting.
Okay.
We've alluded to this in some ways. This is 1922, New York City, Manhattan, and Long Island. But this is I guess in some ways, any period in history is really fertile and historically rich. But late 19-teens, early 1920s United States is especially overdetermined with a ton of different kinds of economic, social, cultural, and political trend lines, all of which are sort of framing the action that Fitzgerald is writing within. So on the first hand, we are in the immediate post-World War I era. And this is an era infamously in American history that is full of labor strife. There's significant class conflict between growing union power and management. We've got the infamous Federal Palmer raids, which were spurred on by an association of organized labor with communism, right? Because this is also the time in which the Russian Revolution is sort of in full flower, I suppose, and the Bolsheviks are coming to power. And so there is this increasing hysteria across Europe and spilling over into North America about the communist threat, the communist menace. And so a lot of American labor movement organizers get linked with, a pro-communist agenda. Sometimes it was accurate, sometimes it wasn't. So there's a lot of repressive crackdown on organized labor in the United States. This is a heightened time of racial retraction and reactionaryism. This is the height of scientific racism as a doctrine of knowledge, which we see very obviously and explicitly in The Great Gatsby. We'll talk about that. This is also a time in which there are sort of cataclysmic social changes going on in the fabric of American life. 1920 sees the passage of both the 18th Amendment, both the 19th Amendment, which is the amendment that guarantees women's suffrage, and the 18th Amendment, which is the amendment that outlaws alcohol and kicks off the era of Prohibition. And both of these events, particularly Prohibition, are framing the action of what's happening in Great Gatsby. At the same time, you've got all of these kinds of propulsive and sometimes reactionary movements in the areas of class and race and gender. You also have this kind of explosive wealth creation on Wall Street. This is the first time in American history in which, as we see in Nick Carraway's experience, in which there's a dedicated financial class and a dedicated financial sector that seems to be very much originated in a particular place, Wall Street. Right? There's a kind of cultural vitality as well, as I alluded to earlier. This is the period in which Hollywood is becoming the center of American storytelling, and there are rapid technological advances in moving picture technology that is being put into place as well. The other thing that's really important is that the forerunners of adding audio to motion pictures and the development of what in early Hollywood referred to as talkies, this is beginning, right? The first mass market talkie will be the Al Jolson's Jazz Singer in the late 1920s, but the technology is moving rapidly towards this. Then we've got the advent of jazz music, and in African-American culture, the beginnings and the kind of fluorescence of the Harlem Renaissance, which is this kind of explosive movement in letters and arts in African-American culture that is centered in New York City. And then there is this kind of intellectual exhaustion, at least in the American intellectual class as well, that has everything to do with the brutality of World War I and what, I think most historians refer to as the kind of, I write in the show notes, the nonsense of World War I. And I mean, the kind of senselessness of the thing, right? As you know better than I, from the perspective of history and the hindsight of history, the conflicts that lead to the outbreak of the most brutal category difference sort of human conflict that World War I was, those conflicts minor, right? Personality driven at best. Certainly not the kinds of broad-scale historical movements that we would later see in World War II, right, that would seem to seed that worldwide conflict. The kinds of stuff that's happening in World War I feels like weird kinds of personality conflicts, different leaders who decide that they can't be seen as not being trustworthy in the world's eyes, and the whole thing is a catastrophe. And one of the prominent ways in which that catastrophic nonsense of World War I and the brutality to which it gave rise was experienced by prominent American intellectuals like Randolph Bourne or John Dewey was that it really tested and in many ways fractured their faith in a kind of progressive vision of history, that the world was getting better and more free as time went on, and that humanity was becoming more and more enlightened. Well, here you had this cataclysmic world event that seemed to be driven by hubris, by misunderstanding, and by ego, individual ego. And so you've got this kind of intellectually, the American space is kind of devoid of a sort of hope or optimism as well. So it's a long way of saying this is an especially fertile period in American history. And as I say, it converges along all of these different vectors of experience.
Yeah, and one thing that's going on in the text that I think makes Gatsby unusual is, in one sense, it's a sort of hyper-specific novel about what's going on with the characters and their kind of interactions and interrelation. And in another sense, it's sort of poetic, or it's alluding to, no, it's not even just alluding to wider things, it's explicitly stating the grandest possible themes and provocations and ideas. That line that as I said, I've read the book twice. You might be able to quote it better than me. But those lines at the very end of the book, not the born back ceaselessly into the past, but the stuff about the Dutch arriving and seeing a natural vista that for the last time in mankind's existence matched the capacity for awe. To have those two things going on in the text, that kind of hyper specificity about particular people, but then these kind of not diversions, but these excursions into something like Milton's Paradise Lost, something as rich and elusive as that, I think makes it quite a remarkable textual experience.
Yeah, and the thing is that all of that is worn so lightly on the text's surface that it allows you, as you say, both to have a hyper-specific sense of time and place, but also there's a reason why 100 years on, this book still reads so cleanly and so clearly and does not feel bound by its circumstances. Part of that is intentional choices, right? I mean, Fitzgerald was very careful not to use a lot of slang, not to use a lot of contemporary lingo, but to write in a more kind of a classical or conservative way, right? But part of that is that the sorts of base level material that Fitzgerald is dealing with here, the nature of individual ambition, the character of success, what it means to wonder and to dream and to hope, these are eternal human themes that are not exhausted by whatever was taking place in the early 1920s in New York City.
Yeah, and that's as you say, that's why it keeps having this sort of recurrence, because the text, you have to remind yourself when it was written and what had not happened in American history by the time it was written. So having Nick Carraway be a guy who goes to make his fortune on the stock market and then learns disillusioning lessons about life and about America reads very differently after the Wall Street crash at the end of the decade.
Yes.
But Fitzgerald didn't know this was happening.
He didn't know it was
always going to happen.
And also that story is still not all that different than you would encounter right now.
Right.
We have legions of people who continue to venture out into the world, imagining themselves as the proprietors of great success, only to find themselves, if they carry the sort of, what we'll talk about is the sort of, I think, a very immature vision of what makes a life meaningful and successful, only to find themselves disappointed by the reality that they encounter.
Right. Okay. Is there anything else you want to say in this section?
I think we should move on to the second level, and we will continue to develop the characters there.
Okay, so we'll be right back, and we're going to talk about our second level, which is mythologies. And we are back with our discussion of The Great Gatsby, and we're going to dig into our second level, which is the level of mythologies, as we try to analyze this text. Jeff, there is no mythology more mythological than that of the American dream.
Yeah, and this is a text that is likely self-consciously engaged in exploring that mythology. And I think it's worth noting, first of all, that this story of American possibility was old and had been told a great many times before The Great Gatsby. But what it had not been done, the phraseology of the American dream was not yet something that existed. This is not something that's going to really come into existence in a kind of cultural sense, this lexicon, until the 1950s. So we should acknowledge at the outset that Fitzgerald is thinking through the predominant story or the predominant narrative that has been told about New World success and New World opportunity, but he's not doing so with the verbiage that we would use today. But, we'll just call it the American dream sort of mythology. And it seems to me that there are two elements. This is what we always need to be careful of when we use the word mythology or when we talk about myth. It seems to me that we're talking about two different types of things here. A myth is mythological in the sense that it's telling a widely shared and understood story about the way that the world works. It's mythological in that way. And that story exists, I should say, independent of its empirical veracity. So independent of how much it can be proven or disproven, the narrative of understanding and the way that it links together distinct communities of people into a clear identity is the thing that matters. So it's mythological in that sense. But myth is also sometimes used as the opposite of truth, right? That myth can be an invocation of something that's widely believed but untrue. And so there, it's not that the empirical veracity is beside the point or doesn't matter. The lack of empirical veracity is exactly the thing that turns it into myth. I think The Great Gatsby is operating in both levels of the question of mythology. But let's start with the storytelling elements. Let's start with the way in which there's a narrative here against which and with which The Great Gatsby is working that is independent of empirical veracity. And this is as I've alluded to, this is the story of New World success, right? This is the story, and it's not just limited to the United States, right? It's a story that a great many European explorers and settlers bring across with them in the back of their head, that the New World is where you go to remake yourself and to pursue success. It's where ambition is limitless, or at least finds fewer limits than what they had imagined they had found in the strict class system, right, that dominated Europe and parts of Asia at the time. And it was an opportunity to go out and to make your way into the world and to enjoy and gain some success that was otherwise seen as impossible. Now, the actual practice of Europeans coming to the New World and being successful for themselves is a story, of course, that is told in blood and horror. But the mythology of New World success tends to minimize, right, the interpersonal conflict, the ethnic violence that in many ways was the beating heart of the possibilities of European success in the New World. And instead, what that story, the story that we can call the story of the mythology of the American dream, instead what it emphasizes is the individual virtues of people who come over and through hard work, through pluck, through industry, through virtue, through the capacity to make good decisions about when to spend money and when to save, that it was possible in the New World to be socially and economically mobile in ways that the known world had never experienced before. And the way that that vision of new world possibility and success gets transfigured in specifically American or U.S. ways comes through the analogy of the melting pot. Now, this is a story. It's an analogy that is very old in the American experience. I don't know how much this is an analogy that's understood or carried over outside of the United States. So maybe you've heard of this before. I don't know. But the idea of the melting pot is first, to the best of my knowledge, is first brought into letters by a French immigrant to the Americas, Jean Hector, see, I always get this wrong, Hector Saint-Jean de Crevecoeur. Mm-hmm. And his famous work, Letters from an American Farmer. He was a French immigrant who had kind of found his way into the New World. He originally came over to fight against the British in the French and Indian War, or what Brits call the 7 Years' War. Then became essentially a British subject. And then during the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, the War of Independence, he shifted his loyalties again to become an American farmer. And
what the Brits know as the Lucky War.
The Lucky War, yes. Lucky for who?
Well, for you, for Americans, the unjust war.
Of course.
The lucky victory.
Yes. The War of Infamy, perhaps.
Yes.
And one of the things that Europeans at the time in the 1760s, 1770s, the reading public, newly literate, still fairly newly literate reading public, was super obsessed with the idea of what were the colonies like, right? What were the Americas like? And so there were these travelogues, right? There's a whole genre of what we would these days call travelogues from Europeans coming over, experiencing the New World, and then writing back for what was then an international audience, but really a domestic audience in Europe. And Crevecoeur essentially wrote, if you want to know what it's like here, and if you want to know the big differences between the New World and the Old World, well, it's all about the possibilities of social mobility and individual success. Because here in this land, it doesn't matter what kind of caste you were born into. It doesn't matter what kinds of inherited class relationships you find yourself a part of. There are no serfs here, and there are no nobles here. Instead, what we have here is the possibility of individual making and remaking according to the virtues of hard work, industry, and capability.
Right. And the melting pot being that you kind of enter this milieu as very different. It's very different people
as
with different
European,
identities.
Or having a particular ethnic identity. But when you enter the United States, it's like you jump into a hot pot, and what's melted off are the differences, right? Those ancestral differences that would matter in Britain, for example, but according to Crevecoeur in this line of narrative thinking, don't matter in the New World, because the only thing that matters here is your individual effort.
Right, and now we're all part of the same great stew of American life.
Yes, and so you jump in as a European into the melting pot, and you come out as an American.
Yeah, which is astonishing because this is coded as like a really good thing. But if you think about it, you're literally like being boiled alive and eaten by someone else or some other thing.
Right, the identity is seen as the inessential parts of who you are, of your identity, are boiled off or removed. And what's left is the hard core of virtue, which makes you American.
Yeah.
And so Crevecoeur is kind of the first person to develop this, but he's not alone. I mean, this is Benjamin Franklin's vision of what distinguishes Americans from Europeans as well. And it's got this long and deep history in the United States and in American culture. And it gets referenced in various ways, the saying that, in the United States, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Individual effort, unaided by others, unaided by government. What it means to have equal opportunity, for example, is that everyone has the same opportunity to succeed, not that everyone is going to succeed.
Right.
This is the kind of the background story of striving, of sweaty, effort-based virtue that is, I think in a lot of ways, it's not just the beating heart of the American dream mythology, it's the beating heart of the Great Gatsby. Because this is Jay Gatsby's vision of how he's going to turn himself into someone who is worthy of Daisy Buchanan and her old money sensibilities.
And he literally writes himself a sort of self-help list, doesn't he? Like, I'll do 200 push-ups a day and I'll work on this skill and that skill and,
And crucially, he is shown to be doing that long before he meets Daisy Buchanan.
Yeah.
So as a teenager, right, he is invested in this vision of American success and ambition and opportunity. As we come to find out, he believes in this so much that he almost makes it real.
Right. And what Gatsby, whereas the Dutch arrived and for the last time in human history, see something that's worthy of human capacity to imagine a different future. Gatsby he's not the Dutch arriving on a ship, right? He's born into an America that places obstacles in front of his ability to do this. And some of the things that what does Gatsby run into? He runs into a woman that he falls in love with who exists within an actually calcified social structure that means he can't have her.
Yes.
He's then sort of physically separated from her by the new world sending its best back into the old world to deal with their problems in the shape of him. He goes off to serve in World War I.
People who can't afford to get out,
right?
Who don't have the inherited privileges of old money, who cannot get out of fighting, right?
Right, and he then physically, the physical barrier that he bumps into after he remakes himself and he becomes rich and he returns from the First World War and he's done all this self-help stuff and he bumps in quite literally to Tom Buchanan, who is one of the characters, maybe the most recognizable character from a British standpoint, because Tom is just he could be an old aristocratic major who's stumbling around with racial prejudice and very clear ideas on social mores, but also, although he has clear ideas about how you should behave, is also like a boorish, predatory, individual, and that's who Gatsby bumps into. How that American, how the purity of America has become the kind of corrupted stolidity of Tom Buchanan.
Yeah, and crucially, Tom Buchanan doesn't do anything. He doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
He doesn't work.
Right.
He doesn't put.
It's very recognizable from a British standpoint.
Right. And Daisy's the same, right?
Yeah.
This is the old money culture of inherited privilege, and that is always sort of hovering in the background of this story, right? It's old money versus new money, and this is what legions, decades, generations worth of commentators on The Great Gatsby have picked up on consistently, is that this is, in many ways, it is a story of class and of the hard, as you say, calcified elements of class lines, the things that cannot really be traversed, even in a world that is apparently as socially and economically mobile as New World United States is meant to be.
The other thing that goes on in the American dream and its corruption is race.
Yes.
And so you say this is a novel about class.
Yeah.
There's also an interpretation that it's a novel about race, and these are not necessarily kind of completely separable concepts. Certainly in American life,
I think that this is one of the most interesting contemporary lines of argument and interpretation about The Great Gatsby. And what's so interesting is that most of this, I think, is actually in the text. And is, I don't even think it's arguable. In some cases, it is absolutely intentionally placed there by Fitzgerald. That this is not simply a story of the hard lines of class and origin and how those things place significant limits upon the possibilities of actual social and economic mobility, but it's also a story about inherited racial privileges and the hard limits that those put on the American dream, but also the kind of the dysfunctions of American race relations, right? And in short, right, the line of argumentation is that multiple of our main characters who have predominantly conventionally been seen as just basically fully white, right? Anglo-Saxon white characters. If you look at the portrayals in movies, for example, all of our characters are always kind of stock Anglo-Saxon characters, right? They're played by actor. I mean, Robert Redford is, kind of an icon of, golden-haired, blue-eyed Western European or Northern European. Leonardo DiCaprio is also made up in that same way. You were talking about, is it Carey Mulligan who plays Daisy Buchanan in the most recent movie? She, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, nothing in the least bit.
Nordic is Fitzgerald's phrase, right?
Right, Nordic. And in a way, this makes sense, right? Because we know that Tom Buchanan is obsessed with a theory of race that gained a lot of prominence in the late 19-teens and early 1920s that emphasized Nordic origins as the seedbed for supremacy, right? That, that the racial types that came from Northern and Western Europe amounted to the best people, right? The most capable, the smartest, the most virtuous people came from those parts of the world. And that all of the other ethnic types were kind of slotted into a hierarchy in which certain ethnicities tended to rank higher in the hierarchy, others lower, but all of them below the supreme spot of Nordic and Western European supremacy.
And must be kept separate from, right? And then had these desires to invade or contaminate.
And the contaminate is critically important in the American story, because by contamination, the biggest fear is interracial relationships, interracial marriage, and, essentially the production of mixed race people. That this was considered, according to that sort of scientific racism that so valued people of Nordic or Teutonic origins, the greatest sin that could be the greatest contamination, right, was not so much people living in the same space, but what they consider to be the contamination of blood. That racial identity was understood to be communicated through blood, right? And so this is the background that Tom Buchanan is working with. And this is explicit in the novel, right? The first time we meet Tom Buchanan, right, he, as a non sequitur, really starts talking about these works of scientific racism that he has been reading and is captured and captivated by. And so we know from the beginning that for Tom Buchanan is an unrepentant racist, and he is that is part of what makes his character corrupt, right, in Fitzgerald's eyes. But the other thing that's happening throughout this novel is that there's significant ambiguity about some of the other characters and their racial identities, some of the main characters. I think maybe in order of how obvious Fitzgerald is, maybe that's how we should go through them. Mm-hmm. The character of Daisy Buchanan. I think is there much doubt that she is mixed race? In Fitzgerald's prose?
Yeah. Doesn't he? Isn't there some? Again, you know the text much better than I do, but there's some sort of. I think Tom is going on about how white he is, and he's like, and I'm really white, and then there is a pregnant pause, and so is Daisy, or Daisy says, and so am I, or so there's some sort of exchange along those lines, right?
So you're referencing the first substantive scene, and this is where Nick Carraway has been invited over to the Buchanan mansion, and so he reunites with Daisy and with Tom. He hasn't seen either of them, and clearly in some time, and he meets Daisy's childhood friend from Louisville, Jordan Baker, who will become, I think, a more important character than she's frequently given credit for, I think, in this novel. And this is the time in which Tom Buchanan is kind of bloviating about his scientific racism and how much he loves these books that he's been reading. And he says something to the effect of, and the really scary thing is that we've got, we're under attack, we're under assault by people who are the lesser races who are coming into the United States, and they're taking away our power, et cetera. It's the sort of the standard white supremacist line. And he says, all of us are under threat, me and you, Nick, and Jordan. And then Fitzgerald writes, and after a imperceptible pause, he looks at Daisy and says, and you too. Now,
obviously not imperceptible.
obviously not, right? It's noted. And I mean, I read past this a dozen times.
Right.
Right. But nothing in this text is unintentional.
Yeah.
Everything, I think, that, as we've been talking about, is carefully and thoughtfully plotted. That means something, right? That pause means something. And it really means something, I think, when you start to dig into to Daisy Buchanan's history as Daisy Fay. So she's from Louisville, Kentucky. Now, Louisville, Kentucky, for long parts of the 20th century, is one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States, particularly of the non-Confederate states. And the reason that's important is that we know historically racial segregation in the United States was not so much about preventing interaction between races. It was about repressing and denying that those relationships were taking place, right? And we know there's a long, long history of white-black relationships and interrelationships, some of which, I mean, it starts off usually as forced, sexual assault. But by the time of post-slavery, it's not that uncommon, particularly, and this makes perfect sense. Well, you live in a particular place with a lot of different people. Why wouldn't you find people, in your community who you have attractions with or you have relationships with that are intimate, right? It makes perfect sense. The ideology of racial segregation in the United States was to deny that those things took place. And if they did take place, that they were automatically illegitimate. Daisy Buchanan is from the world of stratified racial segregation, but that doesn't mean that there weren't constantly interrelationships taking place across racial divides or across racial boundaries. Moreover, where is it that the Fays have gotten their wealth from in the first place? It's almost certainly, as with old money is almost always the case, it's almost always from illicit means, right? New money is frequently accused of gaining its money through illegitimate measures, as we see here, for example, in The Great Gatsby. But the same is true of old money. It's just that old money is better at concealing it, better at hiding its origins. Well, there's very good reason to believe that the Fay empire of wealth comes from forced labor. And forced labor in the United States, particularly during the 19th century, was heavily dependent upon reproducing and making new slaves. How were new slaves made? They were made mostly by white slaveholders raping and sexually assaulting their black female slaves. So it's almost certainly the case that somewhere along the line, right, Daisy Fay has had, right, she almost certainly has black ancestry, right? And this is almost certainly what Tom is alluding to, right? And so I think Daisy, I think it's fairly clear, right? Which makes it strange that she's always portrayed in film versions, on Broadway, as this kind of blonde-haired, blue-eyed, kind of icon, Nordic icon. None of that is actually in the text.
Yeah, and
She's never described in that way.
Right. And it doesn't seem to me that Daisy's completely ignorant of this, right? Because both her and Jordan Baker treat Tom as just a blowhard, and they're just almost laughing at him and going, yeah, they're not on board with this racial supremacy stuff, nor do they see it as particularly threatening, right? It seems like she's pretty aware Tom's aware of what's really going on here.
Yeah. And, and the same is true of Jordan Baker, right? Jordan is a childhood friend of Daisy. She does not come from the kind of wealth that the Fay family comes from, but she grows up and is living in the exact same community, the exact same social, cultural context. And she is also described, when she is described, it is not as a Nordic kind of queen, right, or a classic icon.
She's a tan golfer.
Fitzgerald emphasizes over and over again her skin is tan. She does things like powder her skin white.
Yeah.
to hide, right, some of the tans. She is described in ways that were at the time not infrequently used as racially loaded insults, right? Fitzgerald calls her incurably dishonest. She's a liar. She's portrayed as a cheat. She's portrayed as sort of a kind of a femme fatale, right? Who, knows her sexual worth, I suppose, would be the way to put
She's
it.
fast would be the.
That's literally how
Right.
Fitzgerald puts it, which at the time was a synonym for a woman who enjoyed sex.
Sure, and she was named after. Wasn't she? Doesn't her name come from two fast cars of the Jordan and the Baker?
Yeah, and so there's all kinds of loaded insults there,
Right.
or loaded descriptions that would suggest that there's more going on. And it's also Jordan Baker who, at the end of the novel, when Tom has during the confrontation between Tom and Gatsby in the hotel in New York that happens just before Daisy mows down Myrtle. We'll get to the specifics, but it's notable that as Tom is going on what appears to be a non sequitur about interracial marriage, which doesn't, at least at first blush, have anything to do with what's going on in the love triangle here between Gatsby, Daisy, and Tom. Tom turns it into another racial tirade, which is notable. And the person who sort of defensively announces that, well, we're all white here is Jordan.
Right.
Right? It's a very strange encounter, and we'll talk about it maybe momentarily. But again, it's giving weight to this notion that there's a lot going on here that's just barely underneath the surface, and that was intentionally placed there by Fitzgerald.
Right, and she's the one who explicitly says we're all white here, and she's previously been tagged as incurably dishonest.
Yes.
That's not,
Yes.
as you say, everything's intentional. That's not a mistake.
And then we'll finish, I think, the section on this. I mean, then there's the question of Jay Gatsby himself.
Okay.
Right. And this is the kind of this is the character who, so we know. So if Daisy and Jordan are passing as white, then what we know for sure is that Gatsby is passing as old money, right? That is without a doubt what he's doing and he's described as doing. The question is he also passing as white?
Yeah.
And there, scholars have suggested that there are some clues in here that would suggest that that's true of Jay Gatsby as well. For example, again, his physicality, he is not described in the way that would lead you to a Robert Redford or Leo DiCaprio casting, right? He's never described as blonde-haired, blue-eyed. He's consistently described as having tan skin, but we also find out that he hasn't been out in the sun all summer. Okay. We find out that Nick's first reaction to Gatsby's physicality is this guy, he has such short and finely cropped hair. It looks like he gets his hair cut every single day.
Right.
Now, that would have been in 1920s American culture a kind of a clue, right, that this was somebody who had maybe an ethnic type that would result in curly or thicker hair, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which are more associated with sort of non-Europeans. And that if you were trying to pass as white, you would want to prevent that from ever showing. There is Gatsby's facility with the dance, the foxtrot, which is, a dance that was kind of catching fire in the Harlem Renaissance as, one of the sort of prominent African-American dance moves. And, then there's the confrontation that I alluded to in the hotel. And maybe we should take a break here. And
Okay, we'll be right back with a big fight.
Yeah.
And we are back with our discussion of 100 Years of The Great Gatsby. Jeff, you wanted to bring us back to a confrontation in a hotel room.
So this is in many ways the climactic scene. This is the big moment at which the love triangle is going to get resolved one way or another. And this is also, it's a revelatory scene because the first thing we find out here is that Tom has done some digging into Jay Gatsby's background and where all this magnificent wealth in such a short amount of time has come from. And what he learns is that Gatsby is a bootlegger. He's bootlegging alcohol. He's likely bootlegging drugs. And he is likely involved in gambling through his association with Mayer Wolfsheim, who's modeled after the real world Albert Rothstein, who was the gambler who fixed the World Series in 1920. And so here we get, the first thing we get is the revelation that Gatsby's wealth is illicit. And that the story that Gatsby has been telling, to the extent that he has been telling a story that he is actually from old money or originally from old money, and then it kind of disappeared, but then he got it back, and he's just kind of a businessman, that this story is a series of lies, right? That he's engaged in illegal activities, and that's the source of his wealth. So that's the first revelation. The second understanding that takes place during this confrontation is that Tom's suspicion that there has been something going on between Daisy and Gatsby in the intervening weeks is confirmed, right? Gatsby comes out and says, Daisy and I are in love with each other. We know each other from way back when. She's going to divorce you, and she's going to marry me. And Daisy doesn't seem to be quite ready for this, right? And Tom is, indignant, right? And it's fine, of course, for Tom to have all of the mistresses that he wants. But, in his sort of theory of gender, it's not okay for his wife to be having an extramarital affair. And he says to her, this is crazy stuff. Like, he's effectively saying, how can an old world, money, privileged wife be seduced and taken out of the old world by new world illicit money? He says, this is crazy. He says, the next thing you know, there'll be interracial marriage. And this is, in many ways, I think it's the thing that scholars point to as the kind of the clinching moment in the possibility that Jay Gatsby is passing. Right? Because we know Tom is obsessed with race. We know his white supremacist tendencies are obsessive, and he kind of sees the entire world through that frame. But it appears to be a non sequitur, right? It doesn't appear, why would he go there when he's already announced the problem is a highly refined old world person being seduced by new world illicit money that's gaudy and vulgar. That would never happen. That's crazy. Why then go right to interracial marriage? Well, the line of argumentation is that because he knows, right? He knows on some level that Gatsby is kind of at best ambiguous in his racial type. But of course, he also knows, we're led to believe that Tom also knows that Daisy is passing herself, and so. It's at that moment that Jordan sort of very defensively, Jordan Baker says, well, we're all white here, right? And as you say, she's described as incurably dishonest. And so this is the kind of the theory of race and class that scholars increasingly believe is working in conjunction in the Great Gatsby text. And these are the kinds of things that put the limit on the American dream mythology. This is the kind of we talked about earlier about the difference between seeing mythology as mythological and as myth, as story, as a widely engaged and believed story that operates independent of empirical veracity, and of myth as untruth. And this is where the myth as untruth really starts to work its way, I think, into Fitzgerald's vision. These are starting to be the limits of the possibilities of American social mobility and American economic mobility. And it's these inherited limits of privilege that are just kind of taken for granted, and that the American dream imagines don't exist, but have a kind of a hard, limiting effect on American opportunity and possibility. And as it turns out, I think the Great Gatsby affirms this because, Daisy seems to have a realization there that, she's not going to divorce Tom. And she knows that he's dishonest and cheats on her all the time and that he's a bore. And he's kind of a comical figure. He's an idiot, but he's old money. And so is she. And that's their world. And that's the world she likes and she knows. It's that world of inherited privilege where you don't have to do anything. And whereas Fitzgerald writes famously, you can make an enormous mess out of people and out of things and out of everyone else's lives, and somebody else will clean it up for you.
Right.
It doesn't matter, right? And so that's the moment at which she realizes she will never leave that world. It's also the moment, heartbreakingly, in which Jay Gatsby, on some level, has to realize that his ambition has been impossible from the start.
Right, and that's the sort of the spiritual death of Gatsby, which is why the actual physical death of Gatsby is, unless I'm misremembering the text, just off screen. Just that we don't really need to see this. It actually doesn't really matter how it happened. Like there's a nice kind of twist of irony and tying things together that it's George Wilson that does it. But if Gatsby had shot himself in the head, it serves the same purpose. Gatsby's idea of himself and his plan for life, and maybe to the extent Gatsby's a mythical figure, therefore the American dream has already been killed, and it's been killed, literally in the story. It's a story of lost love, but as you've I think really skillfully brought out, it's more fundamentally the story of the American idea of possibility coming up against the hard, limiting factor of entrenched privilege in America.
It's that. But it's even deeper in a certain way, and more tragic and more cruel in a way. It's about the impossible. What Jay Gatsby is trying to do is he's trying fundamentally to obliterate his past self, to erase who he was, and to create something entirely new, devoid of any markers of identity, devoid of any history. And that is kind of the melting pot logic, right? That's exactly the melting pot logic. You come over here and all of the differences that are alleged to be insubstantial and unimportant get melted away, and you are turned into a new person who is limitless in their capacity to realize a new identity. Well, this is what Gatsby has believed that he could do. This is the dream. The dream is, it takes its physical form in Daisy, but the dream, the real ambition, is to turn himself into something that's amazing, to turn himself into something and to someone who is important and powerful. And the way that he sees that is through wealth, right? The material wealth is the key to power, to understanding, to a kind of self-belief. It's the way in which you become a successful person who can live a life of meaning. And what he finds is that you cannot obliterate the past. Nick Carraway says to him famously, you can't relive the past. And Gatsby says, can't relive the past? Why, of course you can, right? He can rewrite the past. He believes that he can make himself into something new. And he will do anything. We know, right? Honest, dishonest, illicit, non-illicit, any means are justified if this is your vision of what it means to be a success story, if this is what it means to become a meaningful, powerful, capable person whose life has some worth. You will do anything in order to achieve that goal. The tragedy is you cannot ever outrun your origins. You cannot outrun the place, the space, the relationships that make you in the first place. You can complement them, you can exacerbate them, you can maybe tamp some of them down, but they exist nonetheless. And the problem with the American dream, and this is what the Dutch settlers, this is one of the passages that's so skillfully done, and it took me a long time. I would just kind of skip over it because, the big finish is the born Cecil, the boat's swimming against the current, beating against the current, born Cecil, saying that's the big finish. And so as a reader, you rush to that experience because it's an extraordinary finish. But it's the passages before then that really set that up, right? When he's talking, Fitzgerald is imagining, he's got Nick Carraway imagining the first Dutch settlers who arrive on the coast of New York and Long Island, and they see this extraordinary land. It's not just that they, for the last time, as he says in human history, had the capacity of limitless wonder. It's that this wonder was both unwanted and incredibly intriguing, and they desired it. Well, this is exactly what has happened with Gatsby, right? And it's exactly what happens with this kind of mythology, that you can obliterate your past, that you can obliterate and remake yourself into something and someone who's entirely new. What a horrible ambition. What a terrible vision of what it means to be successful, what it means to live a meaningful life. But super seductive, super enchanting, right? That it is simultaneously aspirational and also, I mean, brutally cruel. And that is why, as you say, it doesn't matter how Gatsby's body dies, because his soul, it has been obliterated even before the final scene.
Yeah. And this story, the Gatsby story would become mythological in literary and creative terms to the extent that it's just a classic American story now, you know. And I thought again and again when I was rereading Gatsby this time, and I don't want to take us too far off on a tangent, but I thought again and again of Mad Men, and I thought of Don Draper, who is similarly a man who's not called Don Draper. You know, his name is Dick Whitman, a name that he acquires during wartime when he's sent off into a war he doesn't want to fight. And it's almost in a sense, an updating of those raw materials of the Gatsby myth. You know, Dick Whitman is a Midwesterner who goes east, but for Don Draper, you know, when he's getting closest to his realization of his vision of himself, it's actually the West where he needs to go. And I think that the move to seek reinvention in New York City for Midwesterners was a fatal mistake for everyone involved. They should have really been thinking of going to California.
That's exactly.
Which is what happens to Don Draper. California always means reinvention. But even he can never really escape,
right?
You know, his past. And he rather crucially, in a similar way that Gatsby, not understanding what money and power is, he sees the simulacrum of what it is. He sees it as the gaudy house and the big parties. In the same way as Don Draper, not understanding what it means to be like Roger Sterling, to be from old money, to be truly accepted in Manhattan high society. He sees the path to this as advertising, you know, which is the other great Americans kind of art of bullshit, right? The simulacrum of the good life and the good vision. And rather famously, you know, Don Draper's spiritual death is in the very final scene where he comes up, he's supposed to have gone away to meditate, you know, and kind of finally reach peace with himself. And what he comes up with while he's doing kind of Buddhist reputation is a famous advert for Coca-Cola. And that's where his journey leads him to is you know, again, this great sort of
escape the...
Exactly. He's just so entranced or entangled in the American bullshit. Which is not to, I don't mean to equate Mad Men with Great Gatsby. What I mean is the power of that myth in American creativity and the American stories of themselves.
Yeah, and that's right. And the East-West thing is really important too. And this is the fatal mistake that they both make, right? In mythology, people go west to reinvent themselves. Europeans came west, not east, to reinvent themselves.
East is the past.
East is the past. East is the old. East is where inherited privilege and money is from, and wealth. You don't enter that world and escape, right? So Gatsby should have gone west. And Nick Carraway realizes at some point, right? I think in the end, he realized it's meaningful. He's from Chicago. He goes back to Chicago. This is not a world in which he's going to thrive. And there's a kind of cautionary tale, I think, that Nick Carraway takes from Gatsby's travails. And so, you know, it's a tragic story, and it's a cruel story of somebody who is so deeply deluded by a common narrative, by a common story, by a mythology, who believes it and lives it and aspires to it, and finds that it is impossible, and it was impossible from the start. And it's also worth noting, right, the other person in this story who really believes in it is Myrtle Wilson, Tom's mistress. And how does it end for her when she rushes out to try to join the old money boyfriend? Well, she gets run over.
Yeah.
And her body literally ripped apart.
Yeah, both believe. I forget where I'm ripping this quote off from. It might be the whatever that guy was called who came up with the original interpretation, the mid-century interpretation, Bewley.
Yeah.
but both Gatsby and Myrtle Wilson believe they can replace one of the Buchanans, and both end up dead and find it while the Buchanans just go off on their own.
Right, and this is Fitzgerald has that incredible line about Daisy and Tom that he puts into the words of Nick Carraway. Let me see if I can find it here. Well, to the effect of, these are people who are careless.
Yes, careless
These
people.
are careless people,
Right.
and they just go through the world and they happily and thoughtlessly break things, and they break people, and they make great big messes, and they never have to worry because somebody else will come along and clean it up.
Yeah.
That's the difference
between
old inherited privilege and new money.
Let's talk about critique.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move to our third and final section, critique, where we examine the text for its, ability or provocations towards undermining or denaturalizing one way of living or forwarding different ways of living. I think this is an important section, and I think this text can work at this level. And I often come at this section from the standpoint of something like science fiction, which is explicitly designed to undermine or denaturalize a way of life. I often see critique as being the sort of anti-mythology. Mythologies are not only kind of collectively held beliefs about life that are frequently untrue, they're also often deployed in the service of a conservative or status quo vision of life. And so I often wonder, what is a text doing to kind of underpin this? And I think that can be seen as happening in Gatsby, or the categories that we might use in something like science fiction are not useless here. I mean, this is a text, The Great Gatsby, that although it is about real people in a real time, often sidles up to the edge of the unreal or the surreal, and just kind of pulls back from it. I've alluded to the textual or stated explicitly the textual features of just making grand world historical points in the middle of the narrative about the sort of great arcs of human desires and human civilizations. There's the very famous sort of symbology of the Dr. What's-his-face's eyes that
Ethelberg's
panopticon-like kind of loom over events and seem to be observing from a detached, almost omniscient way. There's also the very, very famously, Gatsby knows that that Daisy lives directly across the bay because he sees the green light from over there, and he sort of reaches out towards it, which is a very sort of, almost 2001, the apes touching the monoliths. It's very, Gatsby's like reaching out for the future, reaching out for
totem.
Yeah, exactly. Reaching out for progress. Yes, and at one point, when he actually meets Daisy again, like his store of enchanted objects has diminished by one because now she's a real and not a kind of aspirational sort of figure. So this novel is doing some things that exist in the register of dystopia or utopia. It's explicitly historicizing the present, and rooting it in a past, which also leads you to think that the present in a hopeful tale can be changed into a future, because the past produced the present, therefore the present is producing the future, so change is possible, but it's also, and those are utopian elements, right? And the green light is a very sort of utopian thing. And this idea of remaking yourself, Gatsby's striving in defiance of set social mores, is very, very explicitly a utopian thing. But it's also really dystopian in that the old conservative order reasserts itself and destroys the insurgents.
Yes.
Which is why I wonder if, and I think I started by asking you a question of, is this sort of an American dystopia? The spoliation of possibilities and the closing down of possibilities. Even that very famous last line, born ceaselessly into the past, going east, which is the past. That is dystopia, right? That is conservatism. That is, you can't escape sins, calcified things. They're going to be reinforced in violence, and if you step outside of them, you're going to be crushed by the system.
Yeah, and that famous line, of course, is set up by it's set up even more tragically in the previous paragraph, in which Fitzgerald writes, he's talking about this distant utopian future, right? That's being striven for. And he says, we can't reach it yet, but one fine day, and then the ellipses, right? That's not hopeful, right? That points to delusion, right? It's mass delusion. One fine day, we're not going to give up,
Right.
right? But the reality is that the current is always beating us back, no matter how hard we paddle.
Right.
It's beating us back into the past of origins, of entrenched identities, of limit. And so there absolutely is a dystopian vision here. And the question is is Fitzgerald suggesting that you ought not try because effort will result in, death, soul and bodily death, too much effort? Or is he trying to suggest that it's the vision of success in the first place? It's the vision of meaning that is problematic.
Yeah.
That when you have people convinced that the only way to live successful and meaningful lives, and therefore, because it's a mythology, it's a vision that becomes a kind of a master narrative of how a community sees itself and understands itself. And so a master narrative of how it's going to make its decisions about how resources are deployed or not deployed, right? There's a political element, of course, to all of this. So is the problem that there's no escape, or is the problem that the narrative itself is rotten and corrupt and dysfunctional that could be replaced by a new narrative?
Yeah.
One that would eventually result in societies and communities, an American nation that was more secure in itself and that understood that it could make decisions differently about how resources are distributed, for example. Need it always be this kind of story of American success or failure where the two exist on a continuum? It's not on a continuum, but exist as polar opposites of one another. So, yes, I think it is absolutely dystopian, but I don't know that it's defeatist.
Yeah.
And so maybe it doesn't venture into the realm of conservatism in quite the same way that a kind of anti-utopian story might frequently do so. So
the most hopeless bit is where he says, for the last time in human history, we saw something that matches our capacity for us. Because that's like Fukuyama declaring the end of history, right? That's very much that's very much what's going on. That's a fairly definitive authorial statement
that's true.
of hopelessness.
Yeah.
The most hopeful bit is that Nick Carraway, who is set up in the book as someone who is not taken in by bullshit narratives, and actually he also is quite recognizable from a British standpoint, particularly when the story starts, because he's constantly being drawn into things that he doesn't want to be a part of, right? It's like, and he's like, I have this great flaw that I don't do X and Y, which means when people mistake this for assuming I want to hear their stupid story. And for the millionth time, I saw the inevitable onrushing story I was about to be told on the supposition that I had any interest in it whatsoever. But that does mean that he is sort of preserved for the text as someone who is able to exercise some independence of judgment. And so the most hopeful thing is when he says to Gatsby, you're worth more than the whole lot of them put together.
Yes.
And that would suggest that actually it's, as you say, it's the striving that's important. What's important about Gatsby is the striving. Now he's been caught up in this materialist nonsense, and he's too naive to understand what real power is and all the rest of it.
Right.
But he's pure of heart, even though ironically he's portrayed as this bootlegger and this, a person who's lying and all the rest of it. That's not the significant thing about Gatsby. It's that he keeps trying, and that to the closest thing we have in the text to an independent judge, that is worth more than all the rest of them, the old corrupt rotten system put together. And what happens in dystopias is that they're commonly portrayed as being conservative anti-utopian texts. Don't try or you'll produce the dystopia. That's not true. They always have figurations of hope. And the real message is, look, this situation was produced, therefore you can unproduce it. And even in the most hopeless situation, some people are trying to make something better.
One fine day.
One fine day.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is a podcast that has taken one fine day and then some. You know, when we started this, Jeff, it was the 100th year anniversary of the release of The Great Gatsby. It's now the 101st year. So happy birthday and congratulations to the book.
One more year on the ledger.
One more year on the ledger. And I think we should leave it there.